A doctor's life is shattered by a single tragic mistake. After losing hope for years, Luke finds himself in the midst of a storm, one that fate has sent to test him once more. This time, while fighting to save 2 lives, he must also confront the darkness within himself. But can saving others help him reclaim his own life? Is it possible to find peace by making amends with the pain of the past? Luke was a former doctor who had left his profession after a devastating tragedy. One of his elderly patients had been discharged from the hospital and later passed away after accidentally mixing up her medications at home. However, her family blamed Luke for her death. That night, before the exact cause of her death was even confirmed, the patient's 18-year-old son, overwhelmed by grief and rage, showed up at Luke's house. Luke was certain he hadn't made a mistake, but he could deeply feel the young man's pain. He understood why the boy directed all his anger toward him and tried to calm him down. "Blaming me is wrong," he said with a trembling yet resolute voice. "It wasn't my fault. Please calm down. I understand your pain, but..." Inside the house, Maria was frantically contacting the police. The situation was spiraling out of control. As things intensified, Maria quietly slipped out through the back door, hoping to help her husband. She grabbed a baseball bat and cautiously approached the attacker. However, it didn't take long for the young man to hear her footsteps. He turned, his fingers tense on the trigger, and suddenly aimed the gun at Maria. Maria froze in fear but took a determined step back, trying to defuse the situation, but it was too late. The gun went off. Maria was shot and died instantly. In her attempt to protect her husband, her entire world crumbled in a single moment. Luke could do nothing but stand frozen, helplessly watching the horror unfold before his eyes. The gunshot echoed in the air as the sound of police sirens grew louder. But it was already too late. Maria's lifeless body lay on the ground, and Luke stood there, paralyzed with grief. In that moment, his whole life lost its meaning. In the aftermath, Luke faced hospital inquiries and legal proceedings. Stricken by deep depression and unbearable grief, he quit his medical career. Living in the home he had shared with Maria and staying in the city became unbearable. Consumed by pain, he sold the house and decided to isolate himself from society, moving to a secluded mountain cabin in a remote town. He no longer wanted to see anyone. He had no expectations for his future. All that remained was a broken man, a shattered life, and a world that had completely fallen apart. He knew that isolating himself was probably the right choice. Even though, as a doctor, he understood deep down that it wasn't healthy, he couldn't bring himself to seek emotional support from anyone. The fact that Maria had died trying to protect him weighed heavily on his conscience. Every night, the tragic events replayed in his dreams, and when he woke up in the early hours of the morning, the first words out of his mouth were, "It's my fault." The overwhelming guilt consumed him, and he had no idea how to cope with the emotional burden that Maria's death had left behind. One morning, Luke woke up and gazed out at the snow-covered forest. For him, it was just another day like all the others. Almost on autopilot, he made himself a cup of coffee, stepped out onto the veranda, and watched the snowfall. For a brief moment he felt a sense of peace, but that feeling came with a weight of guilt. It was as if allowing himself any peace would somehow be a betrayal. The concept of peace felt foreign, almost unwelcome. He quickly decided he needed to distract himself. He turned on his radio just in time to hear the weather report. A severe snowstorm was approaching his area and the surrounding towns. The warning urged residents to be prepared. But for Luke, the only storm he truly faced was the one inside him, the endless storm of grief and guilt. Opening his fridge, he noticed his supplies were running low. He checked his pantry only to find that his stock was nearly depleted. Even his water supply was dwindling. If the storm lasted long, he wouldn't have enough food. He had no choice but to go into town for supplies. Quickly getting dressed, he grabbed his keys and climbed into his pickup truck. As he adjusted the rearview mirror, he caught a glimpse of himself. His hair and beard were wild and unkempt. "Maybe I should stop by the barbershop too," he muttered under his breath. The thought felt odd, almost trivial, but he decided to go through with it. At the small barbershop in town, Luke had his hair and beard trimmed in no time. Through the shop's narrow window, he could see the signs of the incoming storm. The sky darkened and the wind began to howl. He hurried through his shopping, moving quickly through the aisles, picking up bread, milk, water, and frozen goods. Outside, the snow was falling faster, and the wind was intensifying. The once vibrant town had grown eerily quiet under the heavy gray sky. After gathering all his supplies, Luke loaded them into the bed of his truck and headed back toward his cabin. The drive was about 20 minutes, and he was confident he could make it before the storm hit full force. But the storm was moving much faster than expected. Luke drove cautiously, knowing the road well but wary of the rapidly worsening conditions. Snow was already covering the road, and the wind pushed against his truck with surprising force. He navigated each curve carefully, squinting through the windshield as the snow obscured his view. A deep unease settled in his chest. Everything around him was changing in an instant, yet it felt as though some things like the storm inside him never would. Luke muttered to himself, getting a haircut today was stupid, but his thoughts were cut short by the sudden screech of tires and the glare of erratic headlights cutting through the storm. He slammed on the brakes. As he approached a curve, he saw that an oncoming vehicle had failed to make the turn and crashed into the guardrail. Without hesitation, he jumped out of his truck and sprinted toward the wreck. When he got closer, he saw a luxury black SUV embedded in the guardrail, its front end crumpled like paper. Tire tracks in the snow showed how badly the vehicle had skidded. Luke quickly checked inside the car. In the driver's seat, a woman sat unconscious with a small cut on her forehead, blood slowly trickling down. In the passenger seat there was an empty child's car seat, its window shattered. Snow and wind were pouring into the car as Luke tried to assess the woman's condition. Suddenly her eyes flew open and she screamed, "Clara!" pointing frantically at the empty child's seat. "Stay calm," Luke said firmly, but the woman was panicking, thrashing and crying out in pain. "Clara," she sobbed. Luke immediately scanned the area. Beyond the guardrail lay a steep forested slope. In the distance, through the white haze of snow, he caught a glimpse of something red. Without hesitation, he vaulted over the guardrail and carefully made his way down the icy incline. The slope was dangerously steep, and Luke struggled to maintain his footing, slipping and sliding as he went. Finally he saw her, a little girl about 4 or 5 years old, lying motionless in the snow. She had long blonde hair and wore a bright red coat. Luke knelt beside her and checked for a pulse. Was there? He unzipped her coat to check her condition, then gently pulled her close to his chest, wrapping his own coat around her. Holding her securely, he began the difficult climb back up the slope. The storm was intensifying and Luke knew he didn't have much time. With great effort, he reached the guardrail and hauled himself and the child onto the road. He quickly carried her to his truck and laid her across the back seat. As he checked her injuries, he noticed small cuts from shattered glass and suspected she might have a concussion. Time was critical. He couldn't afford to wait. Luke ran back to the wrecked SUV. "She's alive," he told the woman. "But she needs to get to a hospital immediately." The woman's legs were trapped under the wreckage and the door was jammed shut. She could barely move. Luke took out his phone, only to find there was no signal in the area. He realized that freeing her would take too long. He checked her vitals. She was likely dealing with fractures but was still conscious. He leaned in close and said, "Listen to me. I'm going to take Clara to the nearest town's hospital. I have to leave you here, but I'll come back with help. Do you understand? You need to stay awake." Tears streamed down the woman's face, but she nodded in understanding. Luke grabbed a blanket from his truck and carefully covered her. "Don't fall asleep, okay? Stay with me," he reassured her before turning back to his truck. The storm was howling now, snow whipping fiercely across the road. But Luke knew time was running out. He climbed into the driver's seat and set off, bracing himself to battle the storm and get Clara to safety. Despite the storm's intensity, Luke drove swiftly and safely into town. He headed straight to the hospital and stopped in front of the emergency entrance. Carrying Clara in his arms, he rushed inside. The medical staff immediately brought a stretcher and took Clara to an emergency room. As they worked, Luke quickly explained the situation. "Her mother is trapped in a wrecked car on the road. She's conscious but immobilized. Please send an ambulance right away," he urged. The staff wasted no time. An ambulance team began preparations, while Luke led them back toward the accident site in his truck. The storm had worsened, with snow and wind making visibility almost impossible. Luke grew increasingly worried about the woman's condition. He feared she might succumb to the cold, despite his efforts to act quickly. When they reached the crash site, the rescue team immediately got to work. Unfortunately, the woman had lost consciousness by then. She had suffered significant blood loss and was weakened by prolonged exposure to the freezing conditions. Together, the team and Luke struggled to free her from the wreck. Finally, they managed to lift her out and place her in the ambulance. The medics began treatment to warm her up as they prepared for the challenging journey back to the hospital. The storm showed no mercy, making the return trip slow and dangerous. However, after an arduous drive, they reached the hospital. Clara's mother was rushed into the emergency department as the medical staff coordinated her care. Luke, worried for Clara, asked about her condition. A doctor, visibly exhausted, provided an update. She's going to be okay. She had a concussion and a few fractures. We've set her bones in casts and her condition is stable, but we'll continue to monitor her. For now, we need to focus on her mother's surgery. And to be honest, we're stretched thin. 2 power poles collapsed in town, and there are more injured patients coming in. Luke took in the chaotic scene. I'm a doctor. Let me help, he offered. The doctor placed a hand on his shoulder and nodded gratefully. Please do, he replied. Luke put on a medical gown and began assisting with patients. He treated injured people, checked on inpatients, and helped wherever he was needed. Hours passed, and the hospital gradually settled into a calmer state. Luke found himself waiting outside the operating room, anxious for news about Clara's mother. Eventually, a surgeon and 2 doctors emerged. They looked tired but relieved. The surgery was complex and difficult, one of them explained. But she's alive. Her condition is stable now. She had multiple fractures and will need to stay in the hospital for a while. Luke exhaled deeply, a wave of relief washing over him. He had done it. He had saved both the mother and daughter. For the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself a moment of quiet accomplishment. Luke took a deep breath and thanked the doctors. They smiled warmly and said, "You're the one who saved both lives. We just did our job. Actually, we should be thanking you for your help." Luke handed back his gown, nodding slightly. "You're welcome," he replied softly. He then decided to head to the cafeteria to grab some water and coffee. He needed a moment to calm down and clear his mind. It had been years since he had worked in a hospital, and the weight of it hit him hard. His thoughts raced, colliding with memories and emotions he thought he had buried long ago. After a while, the doctor who had been caring for Clara approached him. "Clara's awake. Would you like to see her? Poor girl's been asking for her mother," he said. Luke immediately stood up, following the doctor quickly toward Clara's room. When he entered, he saw her lying on the bed. She looked fragile and scared, her arm and leg in casts, fear evident in her wide eyes. Something deep inside Luke shifted, a protective instinct stirring within him. He slowly walked over and gently stroked her cheek. Sitting beside her, he spoke softly. "Hi, Clara. I'm Luke. It's really nice to meet you." Clara's eyes searched his face, seeking some form of reassurance. Her voice was hesitant as she asked, "Where's my mom?" Luke closed his eyes briefly, steadying himself. "Your mom is going to be just fine. Don't worry," he said gently, doing his best to offer comfort. Clara didn't seem entirely convinced but nodded slowly. Luke decided to ask her about her family. "Do you have anyone else I can call for you? Your dad, maybe?" Clara lowered her gaze and shook her head slightly. "My mom's name is Rachel. But my dad. He died," she said softly. Her voice wavered with every word, the weight of her loss hanging in the air. Luke felt a pang of sorrow in his chest but maintained his composure. "I'm so sorry, Clara," he said quietly. "But I promise you your mom is going to get better soon. You don't have to worry." Clara still looked uncertain, desperate for more reassurance. Luke leaned in gently and continued, "You'll see her very soon, I promise. Everything's going to be okay." To help distract her, Luke picked up a children's book from the bedside table and began reading aloud. The soothing rhythm of his voice gradually calmed the room. Each word seemed to ease some of the tension in Clara's small frame. Slowly but surely, she started to trust him, though the fear in her eyes had not completely faded. Luke knew this was only the beginning of a long road, but in that moment he had taken the first step toward helping Clara heal. With each sentence he read, he built a small bridge of trust between them. The storm inside both of them began to quiet, if only just a little. Luke stayed by Clara's side all night, comforting her, watching over her as she slept, and observing her every movement with care. He did everything he could to ease her fears and make her feel safe. The hospital's dark and quiet halls were filled only by Clara's occasional murmurs during the night. Outside, the fierce storm continued to rage, but for Luke, time seemed to blur and fade away as he remained at her bedside. The next morning, Rachel woke up. The doctors wheeled her into Clara's room and gently helped her onto a bed beside her daughter. When Clara opened her eyes, she immediately saw her mother and whispered, "Mom." Her eyes lit up with hope. Rachel, despite her broken ribs and legs, managed to smile lovingly. "Clara," she said softly, her voice warm with relief, "we're going to be okay." Luke stood back and quietly watched the emotional reunion. He was overwhelmed with gratitude that both of them were alive. Rachel turned to Luke, her eyes filled with sincere appreciation. "I can never thank you enough," she said softly. Luke shook his head gently and replied, "Please just rest. We can talk later when you're feeling stronger." Rachel closed her eyes and let out a deep, peaceful breath. Luke leaned down toward Clara and whispered with a smile, "See? I told you everything would be okay. You and your mom are both going to heal and be home before you know it." Clara smiled back, her trust in him stronger than ever. The storm continued for the rest of the week, and Luke remained at the hospital, checking on Rachel and Clara frequently. He noticed something curious. Rachel spent a lot of time on the phone discussing work but never called any family members or close friends. Eventually, Luke couldn't help but ask, "Rachel, why don't you ever call anyone for support?" Rachel paused for a moment, then took a deep breath. "It's just Clara and me," she explained. "I manage the company my father left behind. I lost my husband to cancer. And the rest of my family passed away years ago." Luke felt a wave of sympathy wash over him. "I'm really sorry to hear that," he said softly. He admired Rachel's strength and resilience. Over time, as they talked more, Rachel learned about Luke's past as well. A deep bond began to form between them, built on shared loss and newfound hope. For the first time since his tragedy, Luke felt a renewed sense of purpose. Rachel's determination and courage gave him a glimpse of a different future, one where healing was possible. After spending 2 weeks at the hospital, Rachel and Clara were finally cleared to leave. Though they were not yet fully recovered, their doctors assured them that their treatment could now be continued at home and at a local city hospital. As they prepared to leave, Rachel, unable to hold back her feelings, turned to Luke and said softly, "Please, Luke, visit us sometime." Luke gave a nod, his eyes lingering on them as they left. An unexpected emptiness settled in his chest as he watched them drive away. It wasn't just the sense of duty or gratitude, something deeper, more personal. Despite his attempts to keep it together, he found himself thinking about them, missing the warmth of their presence. Just a few days later, he made up his mind and decided to visit them in the city. As time passed, the bond between Luke and Rachel grew stronger. Their conversations shifted from the mundane to the deeply personal, and Rachel's quiet encouragement slowly brought Luke back to a place he thought he'd left behind forever. She urged him to return to practicing medicine, to embrace his calling once again. Over time, he found the courage to say yes. Saving lives, he soon realized, was more than just a job, it was a path to healing for himself as well. It brought him peace in ways he hadn't anticipated, helping him let go of the guilt that had haunted him for so long. With Rachel and Clara by his side, Luke discovered a new sense of belonging. In them he found a family, one that offered him the kind of hope he had long since stopped believing in. There were moments when Luke would think back to the day he made the seemingly insignificant decision to get his hair cut before the storm hit. At the time, it had felt like a simple, almost trivial act, but looking back, it became a turning point in his life. That small, impulsive decision had unknowingly set the course for a new chapter, one where healing, connection, and purpose intertwined in ways he could never have imagined. He would always remember that moment with gratitude, as it marked the beginning of a future that was finally beginning to take shape, filled with possibilities and a renewed sense of self. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. With every new video, I'll bring you captivating, inspiring, and unforgettable stories. If you liked it, be sure to hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps us reach more people every day. See you in the next videos.